Two tiny German Shepherd puppies, soaked, trembling, barely 6 weeks old, escaped their kennel on a fog-soaked night, following a scent only their hearts understood. No one noticed when they slipped through the hospital's back door, paws tapping softly across the dim hallway. Behind a half-closed curtain lay a retired Navy sailor, burned, broken, and fading after the fire that stole his home. Doctors whispered that he wouldn't last till morning. Machines breathed for him, humming the slow rhythm of surrender, but when the puppies climbed onto his bed, pressed their warm bodies against his cold hands, and placed their paws on his chest, everything changed. A flicker, a breath, a heartbeat fighting its way back from the edge, a miracle no one could explain, except maybe heaven itself. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. Autumn, thinning into winter, wrapped the coast of Greyhaven in a cold, salt-bitten stillness, the kind that clung to skin and memory alike. The little harbor town on Maine's edge seemed carved out of fog and wind, narrow alleys slick with ocean mist, wooden piers creaking like old bones, and the endless Atlantic heaving in dark green swells beneath a bruised ski. Thaddeus Cole, known simply as Thad by the few who still remembered his name, stood as much a part of that landscape as the boulders along the shore. Once a Navy man with broad shoulders and a voice that carried across ship decks, he was now 73, tall but stooped from decades of storms and battles. His face was weather-cut, a map of wind, grief, and sea. Sparse white stubble shadowed his jaw, and his steel-gray eyes held the tired vigilance of a man who had spent too many nights waiting for explosions that never came. His hearing remained sharp, but his spirit had dulled long ago. Dulled in the instant he watched his closest friend, a cheerful gunner's mate named Ryland Pierce, slip beneath a burning wave after an engine room blast off the Pacific coast. That single moment had carved a permanent fault line inside him. Since then, Thad had moved through life like a ghost still tethered to a shipwreck. He lived alone in a dark-roofed cabin perched on a cliff overlooking the harbor, its back pressed to the stone face and its front bowed toward the sea like a weary sentinel. He kept no photographs, answered no holiday letters, and treated kindness with the same stiff awkwardness he once reserved for enemy fire. Each day he walked to the pier at dawn, checked ropes, muttered to gulls, and returned home only when the sound of the waves finally soothed the old war drums in his chest. Nothing changed in his life, because change required a heart willing to move, and his heart had long ago shut its doors. But the night everything shifted was a night soaked in rain and wind, the kind of storm that made even seasoned fishermen mutter prayers under their breath. Thunder rolled far out at sea, and the tide slammed the pier posts hard enough to make them tremble. Thad held his hood against the gale as he made his way down the slick wooden planks to check on his aging skiff, a stubborn little vessel with peeling paint and a personality only a retired sailor could admire. As he leaned down to inspect the rope, a faint rustling reached his ears, too soft for trash, too persistent for wind. He straightened, frowning, and swept his flashlight toward the far corner of the pier. The beam caught a battered blue fish crate, half filled with icy rainwater. The lid had been shoved aside as though by something too small to lift it. Inside, shivering violently, were two German Shepherd puppies, no older than 6 or 7 weeks. Their fur was soaked through, clinging to fragile bodies whose ribs showed clearly beneath the wet. One pup, slightly larger, had a thin white scar tracing down the bridge of its muzzle, an old wound that looked out of place on something so young. The other was smaller, rounder in the face, with soft brown eyes so exhausted they barely lifted when the light hit them. For a long second, Thad simply stared. In another life, he might have cursed the cruelty of whoever abandoned them, but this version of him, the one who had locked away every warm instinct after Ryland's death, took a step back. These weren't his responsibility, Nothing was anymore. He muttered under his breath, "Not mine, not tonight." Yet something ancient inside him, something from the days when he stood watch under starlit skies and promised his crew he'd bring them home, whispered differently. "Not this time, Thad." He stood still, jaw clenched, fighting the instinct to walk away, the same instinct that had ruled him for years. But the small one whimpered, a breathy, broken sound that pierced him sharper than shrapnel ever had. Thad exhaled, long and defeated. "All right," he growled softly. "Come on then." He scooped the two soaked bodies into his coat, pressing them against his chest. They were frighteningly cold, the kind of cold that made life slip quietly out of living things. He hurried up the pier, boots slapping, heart pounding far faster than it should have at his age. In his cabin, he set them near the old iron stove and kindled a flame until warmth began creeping across the floorboards. He rubbed them with frayed towels, whispered gruff encouragements, then warmed milk on the stovetop and let them lick droplets from his fingers. When the larger pup lifted its head with a flicker of defiance in its eyes, Thad huffed a breath that was almost a laugh. "You," he murmured. "You've got enough fight to light the whole damn harbor. Beacon, that's your name." He looked at the smaller one curled close to Beacon, breathing in thin little whistles. Its eyes were softer, gentler, holding something that felt dangerously like trust. "And you, Mercy, because God knows I've forgotten what that feels like." By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed pale. As Thad set a pot of coffee to boil, a gentle knock sounded at his door. Without waiting for an answer, Eunice Ward pushed it open. Eunice was his next-door neighbor on the cliff path, a 70-year-old widow with soft, round cheeks and a crown of silver hair pinned in a practical twist. She had been a nurse for 40 years and possessed a smile that could coax a confession out of a stone. She also had an unshakable habit of checking on Thad every morning, just in case he forgot what breakfast is. Today she carried a steaming container of chowder. Her sharp eyes widened as she saw the two puppies curled by the stove. "Well, now," she whispered, lowering herself to her knees with surprising grace. "Would you look at that?" Thad scowled, suddenly self-conscious. "Found them at the pier. Someone dumped them." Eunice stroked Mercy's ear, then Beacon's damp scar. "Poor babies." But Thad Cole... She glanced up at him, eyes kind but knowing. "You think you saved them last night. Truth is..." She tapped his chest with one gentle finger. "It's your heart they'll be rescuing." Thad didn't answer, didn't know how. But as Beacon stretched toward the warmth of the stove and Mercy nudged his boot with a trusting little snuffle, he felt something stir in his chest, a faint ripple, soft but unmistakably alive. And for the first time in years, Thaddeus Cole did not feel entirely alone. Winter settled over Greyhaven with a quiet, relentless weight, coating rooftops in salt frost and turning the narrow cliff roads into pale, slippery ribbons above the churning Atlantic. The sea had darkened into a bruised shade of steel, as if mirroring the slow ache that lingered inside Thaddeus Cole's chest. But the cabin no longer felt like a hollow shell. Beacon and Mercy, once two shivering ghosts in a fish crate, had grown into sturdy, bright-eyed pups. Beacon, larger and sharper in his movements, carried a budding confidence. His scarred muzzle gave him a look of young defiance. Mercy, smaller and rounder, always watched Thad with eyes soft as low-tide foam, offering companionship without demanding anything in return. Together they followed him across the beach each morning, their paws scattering sand as they chased gulls and barked into the wind, and Thad felt something he had not felt in years, a reason to rise with the dawn. One late afternoon, as the last smear of fading sunlight slid behind the old pilings, the weather turned violently. Freezing rain thickened into wet snow, hitting the ground with dull, heavy taps. The lamps along the pier flickered like tired sentries. Thad, wearing his frayed navy coat and wool cap pulled low over white brows, was rolling up his fishing nets when the sharp shriek of tires knifed through the storm. The sound was brief, an abrupt thud, not the crash of metal, just enough to unsettle his bones. His instincts, honed over decades of sea duty, tightened instantly. He paused, brow furrowed, listening beneath the hiss of sleet. That wasn't a slip, it was the sound of trouble. He climbed the rocky slope toward the cliff road, Beacon and Mercy bounding close behind, their tails low and ears pricked. At the top, he found a dark blue minivan half slid into a ditch, its back wheels suspended dangerously close to the cliff edge. The headlights painted long, trembling streaks across the snow, and inside, a woman struggled with the door latch. She looked to be in her late 30s. Her hair, a thick chestnut-brown braid that had come partly undone, clung wet to her pale cheeks. She was slender and slightly tall, with narrow shoulders wrapped in a thin gray coat not meant for coastal storms. Her hands shook violently as she tugged at the door, lips moving as if she were whispering directions to herself. Thad rapped on the window. "Ma'am, you all right?" His voice carried the gravel of long years and salt wind. The woman startled, her wide hazel eyes blinking in confusion. I can't hear the road. Everything's muffled," she stammered, her voice airy, breathless. I misjudged the turn." Her speech pattern struck Thad, the way she paused mid-sentence, the faint tilt of her head, as though listening for details she could no longer detect. He opened the door carefully and helped her out. Her body was light, feather-light, and trembling from cold. She smelled faintly of disinfectant and sea brine. "My name's Iona Merrick," she said once he steadied her. "I'm a veterinarian, or I try to be. The sound shifts when storms roll in. It makes everything wrong." She touched her ear lightly, embarrassed. "Old accident on a research vessel. My hearing never came back right." Thad nodded, understanding more than she knew. Old injuries had a way of reshaping a life long after the bandages were gone. Beacon approached first, sniffing her coat with cautious curiosity, his scarred muzzle brushing gently against her hand. Mercy followed, leaning against her leg in a gesture so earnest it drew a thin, shaky smile from Iona's lips. "They're beautiful," she whispered. "They feel safe." Thad cleared his throat. "Storm's getting worse. You're coming with us." He draped his spare rain poncho around her thin frame and guided her down the steep path toward his cabin. Iona moved carefully, almost always one step behind him, as though relying on his steady gait to compensate for the disorientation caused by wind and shifting echo. Her breath came in quick clouds, and snow collected along her braid like powdered sugar. Inside the cabin, the warmth hit her face and softened her features. She crouched near the stove while Thad hung her coat to dry. Beacon sat rigid beside her as if standing guard, while Mercy pressed his muzzle into her palm until she laughed, a soft, surprised sound that brightened the dim room. Once they had warmed up, Thad ladled hot tea into a mug and handed it to her. She cupped it with both hands, inhaling steam with closed eyes. "Thank you," she murmured. "Really, I should have been more careful. The shelters are waiting. They've got injured harbor seals, you know. One with a torn flipper, another recovering from rope entanglement. I can't afford to mess up my first week on the job." Thad studied her more closely now. Her face, oval-shaped, lightly freckled, carried the fatigue of someone accustomed to worrying about everything but herself. Beneath the exhaustion, though, was a quiet resilience. Someone who had chosen compassion even when it cost them. Someone who wasn't afraid of broken things. "You from around here?" Thad asked. "No," she said, shaking her head. "Been drifting city to city, clinic to clinic, wherever I can help." She took a slow breath. "I was supposed to be on a long-term marine research project, but the accident ended that. Lost most of my depth perception in one ear. Can't tell where sound comes from when storms hit." A strained smile. "Turns out the ocean has a long memory for mistakes." Thad's eyes softened. "Aye," he murmured, "a long one." Iona looked toward Beacon and Mercy. These two, they're different. They're attentive, sensitive. She reached out, stroking Beacon's jawline. They could be therapy dogs one day, for veterans especially. Dogs read pain better than we do. Thad stiffened instinctively. Pain, veterans, memory, words that still cut him in old places. But then Mercy nosed gently at his wrist, sensing the shift, and the tension bled out of him. "You mean they could help people like me?" he said quietly. Iona didn't flinch. She simply nodded. "Yes, people like you." The storm howled outside the cabin, rattling the old window panes. But inside, something subtle and shifting passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. Two lives marked by different storms, both collecting driftwood pieces of themselves, trying to rebuild. They spent the evening talking, softly, cautiously, between sips of tea and the crackle of firewood. Iona told stories of stray dogs she'd rehabilitated, of seabirds she once stitched up with trembling hands, of nights on deck, listening to whales instead of sleep. Thad shared little, but enough. Enough to reveal shards of who he had been before the world went silent inside him. At one point, Beacon lay his head across Iona's knee and released a long sigh, as if declaring her presence acceptable. Mercy curled against her side, paws twitching in small dreams. Iona's face softened in the glow of the flames, her hair drying into loose waves that framed her gentle features. "You know," she said, voice low, "when I heard their footsteps following us down that hill, for the first time since my hearing changed, I didn't feel afraid of the storm." Thad felt his throat tighten. He wasn't used to people speaking truths aloud in his cabin. He wasn't used to someone else's voice making the space warmer. The night thickened, the storm raged, and yet inside Thaddeus Cole's home, something unfamiliar took root, a sense that perhaps the tides of his life had not finished shifting. When the fire burned low and Iona began to nod with exhaustion, Thad fetched a spare blanket and offered her the old armchair near the stove. She accepted with gratitude, curling into the blanket as if it were a safe harbor. Beacon lay at her feet. Mercy stationed himself where he could watch both her and Thad at once. Thad stood for a long moment studying the scene. A woman battered by her own storms, two pups who had once been abandoned, and himself, an old sailor who had almost drowned in memories before two small lives pulled him back to the surface. "Maybe," he murmured under his breath, "maybe I ain't done being useful." Outside, the sea pounded the cliffs. Inside, warmth gathered quietly in the spaces where loneliness used to echo. And that was how the second chapter of Thaddeus Cole's new life began, not with a miracle, but with a lost woman finding refuge in a storm, and an old sailor discovering that the world had not yet run out of reasons to keep him tethered to it. Winter tightened its grip on Greyhaven in a way that made even sunlight feel thin, like a fragile sheet stretched too wide across the sky. The cold was dry, sharp, and metallic, more like something hammered on an anvil than born of weather. Snow clung stubbornly to the cliff path above the harbor, while the sea below glittered with a deceptive calm. Thaddeus Cole moved more slowly in this kind of cold, his joints stiff from years of storms, though he never mentioned it aloud. Beacon and Mercy, now several weeks stronger, bounded ahead of him with the earnest enthusiasm of young dogs, discovering the world piece by piece. Iona Merrick had settled temporarily in a rented room above a bakery in town. The owner, a plump, round-faced widow named Laura Hemmings, short, gray curls, warm apron dusted with flour, offered her the room for little more than the cost of cleaning up after the morning crowd. Iona liked the rhythm of it, helping seals at the Marine Rescue Center during the day, checking on Beacon and Mercy in the evenings, and walking home with the smell of fresh bread lingering in her clothes. The routine grounded her, especially on days when her impaired hearing made the world tilt and bend at strange angles. Each evening she arrived at Thad's cabin bundled in a navy coat much too big for her, borrowed from the rescue center, her chestnut hair tied into a loose braid. She would sit by the stove, assessing the pups with practiced hands, checking paws for cold cracks, brushing out their coarse shepherd fur, and guiding them through simple exercises meant to build their confidence. "He responds to hand signals better," she would say of Beacon, "and Mercy listens to the tone of your breath." Thad listened, learned, and found himself unexpectedly proud when the pups mastered a new command. He didn't say it, but Iona noticed the slight lift of his eyebrows, the softening of his jaw. She knew a man fighting his own shadows when she saw one. The day of the fire started harmlessly, too harmlessly, perhaps. The sun lingered unusually long, spreading its weak warmth over the cliffs. Thad spent the afternoon mending a rope, humming an old sea tune under his breath while Beacon and Mercy chewed driftwood by the porch. Nothing hinted at danger. It was evening when he first noticed it. The faint, sour scent near the old gas heater. It wasn't the smell of salt or wet wood or burning oil. It was something heavier, metallic, wrong. He frowned, bending his stiff knees to inspect it more closely. The heater was decades old, one he refused to replace out of stubborn loyalty. He muttered, "I'll deal with it in the morning." He had weathered worse things. A little gas wouldn't scare him, but he forgot what storms could do to pressure. As night deepened, the wind shifted abruptly off the sea, ramming against the cliff like a shoulder against a locked door. Greyhaven's fishermen often said the wind could trap breath inside houses on nights like this. They weren't wrong. The draft pushed air inward and downward, forcing the trapped gas to pool invisibly along the floorboards and under the furniture. Thad, long accustomed to the smells of oil and seawater, didn't sense the danger. Close to midnight, a single spark escaped from an aging electrical socket beside the heater, an almost innocent flick, no larger than the blink of a firefly. It was enough. The room erupted in a sudden cone of flame that raced along the dry wood panels, climbing the walls, licking toward the ceiling in hungry orange tongues. Beacon jolted awake first, issuing a deep, frantic bark. Mercy darted to the bedroom, scratching violently at Thad's arm. Thad woke into chaos. Smoke dragged through the air and heavy waves clawing at his throat. His eyes stung. The room spun. "Easy, easy, come on," he coughed as he staggered toward the door, pushing the dogs ahead of him. His lungs burned as if someone had poured boiling water down them. Beacon barked at the doorway, urging him while Mercy circled behind him, whining. The flames roared louder, feeding on the dry roof beams. Somewhere outside, a window cracked in the heat. Eunice Ward, the silver-haired nurse from next door, was preparing for bed when she saw the first flicker of red reflecting in her window pane. Her heart seized. She threw on a shawl and bolted from her house with a speed surprising for a 70-year-old. Her face, usually soft with warmth, tightened in fear as she barreled up the path. At that same moment, Iona Merrick was returning a borrowed vehicle to the harbor lot. The headlights from the truck illuminated a rising column of smoke twisting above Thad's cabin. Panic shot through her. She slammed the truck door and sprinted toward the cliff stairs, the cold slicing at her lungs. Her braid came undone, whipping behind her like a dark ribbon in the wind. By the time Eunice and Iona reached the cabin, flames were pouring from the windows, casting violent shadows across Thad's porch. The dogs had made it out, Beacon barking wildly, Mercy pawing at the door as though trying to dig through it. The sound of their distress cut through Iona's blurred hearing like a knife. Inside the cabin, Thad was on his knees, half blinded by smoke, fingers grasping for the doorframe. His vision flickered. His mind slipped between present and past, merging smoke with engine room fire, merging roasting timber with the memory of Rylan sinking beneath black water. Through the haze, two silhouettes appeared, Iona's slender form and Eunice's sturdy frame. "Thad, grab my hand," Iona shouted, her voice strained and uneven from the distortion of her damaged hearing, but Thad recognized the shape of her mouth, the urgency in her eyes. He reached out. Eunice hooked her hands under his arm, her rosary swinging from her wrist as she braced her legs. Together they hauled him out, just as a flaming beam above the doorway cracked. The force of the falling timber slammed into the porch, knocking Thad sideways onto the frozen ground. The impact rattled his ribs and knocked the breath from his lungs. His consciousness began to fade. He heard Beacon's frenzied barking as if from underwater, Mercy's soft, trembling whine pressed against his ear. Somewhere behind them, Iona's voice, hoarse and breaking, called his name. Then darkness closed in. When Thad opened his eyes again, barely, faintly, he was no longer on the cliff. Ceiling tiles drifted above him like pale clouds. Masked faces hovered in and out of focus. A sharp smell of antiseptic filled the air. His chest felt heavy, each breath a distant battle. A nurse's voice murmured, "Pulse weak but stable, get the ventilator ready." He slipped under again. The Greyhaven Naval Clinic was small but well-equipped, run by people who knew too much about injuries caused by old war and new accidents. They sedated him, placed him on a ventilator, and began treatment for burns, smoke inhalation, and chest trauma. Thad's world dimmed to a hum of distant machines. Beacon and Mercy, refused entry at the clinic, were taken to the Marine Rescue Center, where the staff, already fond of Iona, set up a makeshift pen for them. Beacon paced relentlessly, eyes fixed on the door, as though willing Thad to appear. Mercy lay curled against the fence, tail tucked, trembling in small bursts of fear. In the hospital chapel, with its small stained-glass window of a calm sea and a wooden cross above the altar, Eunice knelt alone. Her silver hair glowed under the candlelight. Her joints ached, but she clasped her hands tightly, rosary entwined between her fingers. She whispered, "Lord, you've taken his boat and his peace. Please, please don't take the sailor too." Outside, winter pressed against the world, in cold, unyielding silence, as if waiting to see whether Thaddeus Cole would rise again or drift away like another forgotten piece of wreckage, swallowed by time. Greyhaven's dawn crept in slowly, smothered beneath a blanket of sea fog so dense it made the harbor lights blur like faint lanterns beneath water. The storm had passed, yet the town remained wrapped in stillness, thin air, cold salt, and the faint echo of waves scraping gently along the pilings. In the Marine Rescue Center's kennel room, Beacon and Mercy stirred before anyone else. Their fur was still scented faintly with smoke from the night their world had burned. More than anything, they smelled the fading trace of Thad's coat, salt, old wool, and the metallic ghost of fire. Beacon lifted his head first, ears pricked forward. Mercy whined softly, nose pressed to the gate. A small flaw in the latch, a carelessness from a tired volunteer, shook slightly in the morning breeze drifting under the door, a soft metallic click. The gate swung open. The two young German shepherds exchanged no glance, no bark. They didn't need to. Instinct spoke louder than training. Beacon slipped out first, lean legs steady on the tile floor, tail held low but firm. Mercy followed, smaller and quieter, her amber-brown eyes filled with purpose deeper than fear. They trotted toward the back exit, noses pressed close to the ground, as if reading an invisible map of sense. Outside, the world felt damp and hollow. Fog clung to the wooden pier planks. Their paws thudded on the old boards as they crossed the bridge over the shallow inlet, past the shuttered bait shop, and wove through the narrow stone paths between the church and the row of fishermen's cottages. Not once did they pause to rest. Their breaths puffed in two small clouds that vanished into the cold. At the same moment, Osvaldo Oz Mendez leaned against the emergency entrance of the Greyhaven Naval Clinic, smoking a cigarette he pretended he was trying to quit. 50-ish, broad-backed, with a salt and pepper beard trimmed neatly against a square jaw. Oz had the kind of face that looked carved from warm stone. He had been a marine mechanic years ago, but an engine explosion took the hearing in his left ear and carved a faint scar across his cheek. Since then, he had sworn that every living thing deserved patience, because he knew what it felt like to need a second chance. He saw them before he heard them, two small shapes bursting through the fog, paws throwing up frost. "Well, would you look at that?" Oz muttered in a low, amused rumble. The pups scrambled up the steps, Beacon bounding ahead while Mercy, lighter on her paws, paused only long enough to sniff the hem of Oz's work pants. "Where you two going, huh? Some mission briefing I wasn't invited to?" Beacon barked once, sharp, purposeful. Oz exhaled a smoky sigh, half a laugh, half a prayer. Go. I'll pretend I never saw you." With a conspiratorial glance around, he pushed the emergency door open just enough for the pups to slip through. Inside, the corridor hummed with low fluorescent lights. It was too early for nurses to be bustling. The halls felt almost sacred in their quietness. Beacon moved steadily, guided by the scent, the antiseptic tang mixed with the warm, familiar thread that belonged to Thaddeus Cole. Mercy kept close, her tail brushing Beacon's hock as if anchoring herself. They reached the room labeled Thaddeus Cole, CCU. The door wasn't fully closed. A wedge of pale light spilled onto the floor. The pups nudged the gap wider and stepped inside. Thad lay motionless, his weathered face drained of its usual bronze hue. His white hair, normally swept back in stubborn lines, fell loose across the pillow. The chest monitor beeped slowly, too slowly, its rhythm a fragile echo of the heart that had led ships through storms. Machines breathed for him, tubes snaked along his arms, and his once broad chest rose only because the ventilator demanded it. Beacon leapt soundlessly onto the bed, his small paws pressed gently against the thin hospital gown over Thad's ribs. Mercy curled against Thad's arm, resting her entire warm, trembling body along the length of it. Her muzzle nudged the back of Thad's hand, licking once, as though coaxing blood back into cold veins. Beacon lowered his head, touching the dry, smoke-scarred skin of Thad's cheek with his nose, a breath of silence. Then, beep, a stronger one. Beep. The line on the monitor fluttered, then steadied into a slightly faster rhythm. Down the hall, Dr. Merritt Sloan, Greyhaven Naval Clinic's senior physician, was reviewing patient charts. A man in his early 60s, Sloan had the kind of face shaped by storms. Angular features, a stern brow softened only by deep-set gray eyes that had seen too much war. Before becoming a doctor, he'd been a Navy field medic in Beirut. A blast had crushed his left knee, ending his service, but not his devotion to saving soldiers. He had since become a quiet guardian of Greyhaven's wounded. When he heard the soft alarm from Thad's monitor, he moved fast despite his limp, gripping his cane with practiced force. Suttoning the chart under his arm, he pushed open the door and froze. Two German shepherd pups on the bed, a dying sailor breathing stronger beneath them. Sloan blinked once. Well, I'll be damned. Beacon didn't move. Mercy only pressed closer. The monitor's numbers climbed again, marginal but unmistakable. Thad's chest moved, not because of the ventilator, but with a weak inhale of his own. Sloan stepped closer, awe and disbelief warring across his stern features. "This isn't medically explainable," he whispered, voice gravel-thin. "But it's happening." Thad let out a broken, rasping exhale. His eyelids fluttered. His gaze drifted upward, unfocused. Sloan leaned in, tension knotting his shoulders. Then Thad's eyes shifted just enough to glimpse two blurred shapes of black and tan fur. His lips twitched, barely, but it was a smile. His voice emerged as a hoarse whisper scraped from the bottom of the sea. "Reporting for duty already, good boys," Beacon whimpered. Mercy licked Thad's wrist. Sloan, swallowing hard, reached for the intercom. "Get Nurse Patterson and call family. No, call Iona Merrick and Eunice Ward first." Minutes later, Eunice burst through the door, cheeks blotched red from the cold, breath shaking. Iona followed, hair wild beneath her hood, eyes wide with stunned hope. Eunice pressed both hands to her mouth when she saw the steady rise of the chest beneath the blankets. Iona's voice cracked. "Thad, Can you hear us?" Thad turned his head, slow as the tide, and blinked at the blurred pair of faces. His eyes glistened, not from smoke this time, but from something warmer. Sloane cleared his throat, wiping at the bridge of his nose. "I can't explain it," he said quietly, "but these two little sailors just woke him up." And Greyhaven, never slow to share a miracle, carried the story beyond its fog-shrouded harbor. First to fishermen, then to dock workers, then to the little bakery where Laura Hemmings dropped her tray of cinnamon rolls upon hearing the news. Within hours, neighboring towns had picked up the tale. 2 shepherd pups wake retired Navy sailor from coma. Some stories drift like fog, others like ripples. This one surged like a tide. Spring eased into Greyhaven shyly, like someone knocking on a familiar door after years away. The winter storms loosened their hold on the sea, and the frost retreated from the cliffs, one thin layer at a time. The Greyhaven Naval Clinic brightened with longer daylight hours, and along its quiet corridors, Beacon and Mercy became small, soft heralds of hope. Their paws clicked gently on the polished floor, their tails brushing the air as they padded from room to room under the watchful approval of Dr. Merritt Sloane. Sloane had argued staunchly for their presence. He had stood before the hospital board, his weathered face framed by his salt-gray hair, his posture stiff from his old knee injury, and stated in a voice rough from years of war medicine, "These dogs do what half our medications can't. Either we let them stay, or we accept we're choosing rules over recovery." For a man who rarely showed emotion, that had been thunder. The board relented within the hour. Beacon and Mercy quickly became legends. They visited amputee veterans who once refused physical therapy. They curled against sailors who woke screaming from ocean nightmares. Beacon, braver, would place his paw gently on a trembling thigh. Mercy, softer, would nestle her head beneath unmoving hands until fingers unfurled and stroked her fur with trembling gratitude. The staff joked quietly that the puppies had higher success rates than the psychiatric department. Thaddeus Cole healed slowly. His burns recovered. His lungs relearned strength, and his spirits, those long buried beneath years of guilt, rose like a tide at dawn. Though he still walked stiffly and tired easily, something inside him had shifted. The old sailor, once convinced he had nothing left to give, found himself absorbing warmth from Beacon and Mercy the way an abandoned pier absorbs sunlight after a storm. It was during one of Thad's physiotherapy sessions that Iona first proposed her idea. She had been sitting with her back straight against a wooden chair, her chestnut hair braided loosely over one shoulder, listening to the rhythmic scrape of Thad's walker on the hospital tiles. Her hearing remained inconsistent, some days sharper, some days distorted, but she had learned to read rhythm, tone, and breath better than most people read words. "You know the abandoned boathouse on the northern pier?" she asked. "The one nobody's used since the storm 20 years ago?" Thad let out a small grunt. "Aye, roof leaks like a broken barrel. What about it?" "I think it could be something," she replied. "Somewhere people and animals could heal, together. A place we don't have to pretend we're fine just to get through the day. A harbor for those drifting." Thad paused. The walker's metal legs squeaked slightly. He studied her face, its freckles, its quiet determination, the softness that came not from fragility, but from choosing gentleness in a world that rewarded hardness. "A boathouse for broken souls?" he asked. Iona smiled. "More like a home where broken souls can fix each other." Thad didn't answer at first, but that night, when Beacon curled at his feet and Mercy rested her chin on his knee, the idea settled into him like an anchor finding ground. The next day, he told Eunice Ward. Eunice, gray hair pinned neatly, her nurse's cardigan smelling faintly of lavender, didn't hesitate. "Then we make it happen," she said, her eyes bright with purpose. "People need a place like that. You needed it. Those little dogs needed it. So do many others here." Within weeks, the plan spread faster than the winter tale of the puppies, waking the retired sailor. Oz Mendez, with his scarred cheek and soft heart, volunteered to clean the rusted interior of the old boathouse. "Figure every soul got a job," he told Thad. "Mine's making sure this place don't fall on anyone." Dr. Sloan drew up safety plans and used his old naval contacts to acquire medical supplies. The fishermen, hardened by salt and wind, contributed lumber. Laura Hemmings, the bakery widow, baked pastries for every volunteer workday. Cinnamon rolls, blueberry scones, sugared brioche. Even quiet families who had lost loved ones at sea came, hammering nails with hands that trembled but wanted to build something lasting. And Thad, who had once believed he had nothing left to offer, found himself at the center of it all, issuing instructions in his calm, gravel-kissed voice. His silver hair gleamed under the sun as he oversaw the repairs. Beacon and Mercy became the project's mascots, weaving under ladders, tugging stray ropes, stealing gloves when workers weren't looking. By early spring, the boathouse transformed from a creaking skeleton into a warm haven of cedar and soft lights. A new wooden sign hung proudly over the freshly painted door, "No soul left adrift," a harbor for veterans and rescued animals. The grand opening was modest but full of heart. The floorboards shone with new varnish. The air carried the scent of pine and distant waves. Along the walls hung framed photographs, black and white snapshots of Thad in his youth aboard a naval vessel, a picture of Oz with his engine crew long before the accident that changed him, fishermen smiling with fog rolling behind them, and at the center a large photograph of Thad in his hospital bed with Beacon's paw on his chest and Mercy's head near his arm, the moment life came back to him. Winter arrived again before anyone realized how quickly the months had passed. Snow gathered on the roof in soft waves. The harbor lights reflected across icy waters like tiny candles floating on the sea. The boathouse had become a sanctuary, some nights filled with quiet conversations among veterans, others alive with children laughing as Beacon and Mercy chased them around the tables. And always, at the corner, Eunice serving cocoa with hands that had saved countless lives. On Christmas Eve, lanterns lit the pier in amber circles. Inside the center, Iona played an old upright piano donated by a retired fisherman. She played slowly, her fingers gliding as though guided by memory rather than sight or sound. The children sat around her, Beacon and Mercy curled among them, soaking in the warmth of the night. Thad stood near the entrance, his posture straighter than it had been in years. His skin, once sallow from smoke and grief, now carried a soft winter glow. He wore a dark wool coat and a knitted scarf Eunice had made for him. His eyes, still carrying the storms of decades, were finally calm. He placed a hand on the wooden sign nailed outside, brushing his fingers over the carved letters. "Years ago," he said softly, mostly to himself, "we feared being left behind at sea. Now, at least here, no one has to drift alone." Beacon and Mercy lifted their heads, ears perked as if understanding something in the weight of his voice. Inside, laughter and music spilled into the cold night, light and warmth and life. A community rebuilt by the smallest miracle, a burned cabin, a near-lost sailor, a woman drifting through fog, and two little dogs who refused to let a soul slip away. No soul left adrift. Not anymore. In the quiet corners of our lives, where the world feels heavy and our strength runs thin, God often sends his miracles in the smallest, most unexpected forms. Not with trumpets, not with thunder, but with gentle footsteps. A soft bark, a stranger's kindness, or the simple courage to love again. Just like Thaddeus Cole, many of us walk through days carrying wounds no one sees, memories that ache, regrets that cling, loneliness that settles deep. Yet God never lets a soul drift forever. He sends reminders, a loyal animal, a friend we didn't expect, a moment of grace when the night feels too long. Miracles do not shout. They whisper, and if we listen, truly listen, we will hear God saying, "You are not alone." So as you end this story, may you carry its light into your own days. May you look at the world around you and recognize the quiet miracles already standing at your door. And may the love in this tale remind you that whenever we reach out to rescue a life, human or animal, God is rescuing us right back. Before you leave, I invite you to do 3 small acts that help this message reach more souls who may need it tonight.